Welcome to the debate. Today, we are examining the reflections of a really remarkable source, Mabel Rose Thompson, a 103-year-old woman who recently shared what she calls her 10 brutal truths about happiness.
Yeah, and having outlived 4 presidents she disliked and buried, I think, 7 of her own doctors, Mabel offers a deeply provocative perspective on what makes a life actually worth living.
Exactly. But as we comb through these stories of the people she's known and outlived, a central recurring question emerges that really demands rigorous analysis. When I read this, I keep asking myself, meaning, why did this happen to the characters? When we look at the tragic, unfulfilled fates of these specific individuals Mabel describes, we have to ask what truly drove their demise.
Right? To me, it demonstrates that these characters' tragic ends were primarily driven by her own conscious choices to postpone joy, to harbor bitterness.
And, while I find her reflections emotionally resonant, they really are beautiful. I believe we have to be incredibly careful here. Mabel's explanations often conflate biological realities with emotional failings, and that results in a narrative fallacy that inappropriately blames individuals for, completely unpredictable medical and circumstantial events.
See, to really understand what Mabel is getting at, I think we have to look past the medical charts. We are looking at the lived experience of human beings, the tragedy of these individuals, the profound why behind their empty lives and unfulfilled ends is deeply tied to human agency. Mabel is diagnosing the soul, not the body. Take the specific example she provides of her friend Betty, who spent 40 years at the telephone company postponing her life, or her neighbor Walter, who carried a backpack full of rocks in the form of a decades-long grudge. Their ultimate demise, stripped of meaning and fulfillment, is a tragedy of their own making. It was driven by misplaced priorities and the illusion that they had infinite time.
I come at it from a different way, primarily because I value conceptual clarity. When we analyze why these things happened to Mabel's characters, her framework borders perilously on the just world fallacy. That's the cognitive bias, assuming people get exactly what they deserve based on their moral or emotional actions. Let's look closely at the language she uses regarding Walter. She explicitly claims, "The cancer didn't kill Walter, the hate did. The cancer was just the method."
It's a powerful statement.
It is, but I have to push back strongly there. Holding on to hate is psychologically unhealthy, absolutely, but using a sudden terminal cancer at age 68 as proof of moral or emotional failure, that strips away the stark reality of biological vulnerability. Why this happened to the characters is largely a matter of unpredictable biology and circumstance, not some cosmic punishment for their emotional missteps.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the concept of luck and circumstance, specifically through the lens of Betty. Let's look at the evidence Mabel presents. Betty worked at the telephone company in the 1960s. Every day, she said, "Just 10 more years, then I'm retiring to the coast. I'm going to open a little bakery. I'm going to make pies every single day, and that's when I'll start living." Right? But she dies at 62, just 2 years before retirement. Mabel makes a very explicit statement here. She says, Betty wasn't unlucky. She was postponing happiness. Betty treated happiness like a bill she could keep pushing to the next month. In psychology, we sometimes call this the deferred life plan. She fell for the lie of, "I'll be happy when."
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered this socio-economic reality of Betty's life? We are talking about a working-class woman in the 1960s relying on a pension. Betty was making a highly rational, practical survival strategy to secure her retirement. She was putting in her time at the telephone company so she could afford to move to the coast and open that bakery. Dying at age 62, just 2 years before she could cross that finish line, that is fundamentally, mathematically unlucky.
But is it just luck? Because Mabel, who worked for 31 years herself as a first-grade teacher, isn't criticizing the fact that Betty worked. She understands duty. What she's critiquing is the cognitive framing. Betty viewed her daily life as a waiting room.
Hold on. We can't just gloss over the power dynamic of who is telling the story here. We have to talk about retrospective survival privilege.
Retrospective survival privilege.
Yes, Mabel is 103. She has the profound luxury of looking backward from a century of life and grading the survival strategies of someone who only got 6 decades. It is very easy to tell someone they shouldn't have worried about their pension when you've had 40 years of retirement to think about it. We cannot fault Betty for lacking the clairvoyance to know she would die at 62, and using her premature death to validate an idealized, spontaneous existence feels like a misapplication of hindsight.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it quite differently. I don't think Mabel is judging the pension itself. She's diagnosing the psychological safety of living in the future. The deferred life plan is essentially a defense mechanism against the vulnerability of the present moment. Betty said, "That's when I'll start living." She completely divorced meaning and joy from her present reality. Mabel explicitly says, "Happiness is not a destination. It is not a reward you receive after you finish the hard part." Betty's profound misfortune was a failure of agency. She chose to believe her life hadn't started yet. The tragedy isn't that she died. The tragedy is that she spent 40 years waiting to live.
I understand the philosophical beauty of finding meaning in the present. I really do. But I must maintain that labeling a premature death as anything other than a tragic disruption of a well-earned plan shifts the blame onto the victim of circumstance. And this brings me back to what I consider a much more dangerous application of this logic in Mabel's anecdotes: the death of Walter.
Ah, the neighbor with the grudge.
Exactly. Walter read health books. He ate clean. He exercised every morning at 6. He did everything right by every measurable standard of preventive medicine. Yet, he died of cancer at 68. Mabel's assertion is that 40 years of hate over an inheritance dispute killed him. She literally calls the cancer a mere method for the hate to execute him. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that.
Why not?
Presenting a terminal illness as the physical manifestation of a bad attitude is scientifically dismissive. It implies the people who get cancer somehow brought it upon themselves through insufficient forgiveness or hidden bitterness.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it takes a profound existential truth and aggressively reduces it to a literal ontological claim about oncology. Mabel is not writing a peer-reviewed medical paper on the pathogenesis of cancer cells. She is offering a retrospective on the human spirit. When she says the hate killed him, she is saying that Walter existed. He did not live. By refusing to go to family gatherings, by refusing to even say his brother's name without his jaw tightening, Walter's spirit was dead decades before his body finally gave out.
But words matter, and calling cancer a method of a bad attitude crosses a line from existential metaphor into biological reductionism.
Okay, let's elevate this beyond just a metaphor then. If we look at this through the lens of somatic symptom disorder, or the concept of allostatic load, there is rigorous science backing up what Mabel was saying. The physiological reality of chronic stress, the constant flooding of cortisol into the system from holding on to rage for 40 years, does ravage the body. Walter was carrying a backpack full of rocks every single day. Or, look at it through Viktor Frankl's logotherapy. Frankl talks about finding meaning even in the most inescapable suffering. Walter did the inverse. He manufactured suffering out of a mundane inheritance dispute. The cancer ended his biological functions, yes. But the bitterness ended his life 40 years prior. Contrast Walter's choice with Mabel's own decision to forgive her mother.
Okay, let's explore that contrast.
Mabel describes her mother as a hard woman, cold and sharp when stressed. Mabel carried anger about how she was raised for decades, but she realized that by holding on to it, she was letting her mother live rent-free in her head. When Mabel actively chose to forgive her, she notes that nothing changed about the past, but everything changed about what she was carrying. She says, "I got lighter. I got free." This proves the central thesis of agency. Why did this happen to these characters? Because Walter chose the rocks and Mabel chose to put them down. Walter's tragedy was absolute because his emotional death preceded his physical one.
I entirely validate the psychological liberation Mabel experienced through forgiveness. Releasing rumination is undoubtedly beneficial for mental health, and reducing allostatic load is a real physiological benefit. But we must strictly separate the emotional benefit of forgiveness from the biological reality of mortality. If Walter had forgiven his brother, he still likely would have had cancer at 68. The danger in Mabel's narrative is the subtle implication that her lightness and freedom are somehow correlated with her longevity, while Walter's bitterness is correlated with his early demise. It creates a paradigm where we view health as a moral achievement and illness as an emotional failing. This is a profound misreading of why these physical events happen to these characters.
But reducing this to pure biology completely misses the human element. Mabel isn't saying, "Be nice and you'll live to be 100." She's saying, if you're going to live, actually live. Let's look at the story of Margaret, Mabel's sister. This is perhaps the most striking example of the intersection between unpredictable biology and human choice. They had a falling out in their 40s over their mother's furniture. 3 years of absolute silence. And then, as Mabel notes, Margaret died suddenly at 53 of a brain aneurysm, gone between Tuesday and Wednesday.
A devastating story.
Utterly heartbreaking. Now, Mabel does not claim the argument caused the aneurysm, but she uses this to illustrate exactly why the tragedy of unsaid apologies happens. It comes from what she brilliantly terms the arrogant assumption that there will be more time. The psychological fault, the true tragedy of the characters, lies in assuming there is a later. As a lesson about the preciousness of time, it is incredibly powerful. The ticking clock is not a metaphor, as she points out.
But again, we have to be extremely careful with how we apply this lesson to human behavior. Using a sudden, completely unpredictable brain aneurysm to validate a theory of immediate conflict resolution places an impossible burden on people.
How is it an impossible burden to ask people to forgive?
Because if we lived every single day treating every minor disagreement as if the other person might drop dead of an aneurysm by Wednesday, we enter the realm of terror management theory. We would be paralyzed by existential anxiety. We would never be able to hold boundaries. We would never be able to process complex relational trauma, because the sheer terror of sudden death would force premature, often inauthentic resolutions. We need time to heal. Judging the validity of our emotional processes by the metric of sudden death is an impossibly severe standard.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on what Mabel is actually demanding of us. She isn't asking for anxious paralysis. She is asking for radical presence and a peeling back of the ego. The 3-year silence between her and Margaret wasn't about holding a healthy psychological boundary against abuse. It was, in Mabel's own words, a stupid fight over a dining room table. It was pure ego.
Even so, human beings are allowed to have ego. We are allowed to have fallings out.
Of course we are. But the arrogant assumption is the belief that our petty grievances are more important than our connection simply because we think we have decades to eventually fix it. Mabel is highlighting that the pain eating her from the inside out wasn't just the grief of losing her sister. It was the regret of squandering 3 irreplaceable years on pride. The tragedy happened to these characters because they prioritized their pride over their presence.
But this relies entirely on retrospective bias again. If Margaret had lived to be 90 like Mabel, they likely would have reconciled in their 50s, laughed about the dining room table in their 60s, and the 3-year silence would be a mere blip in a long relationship. It is only the random strike of the aneurysm that retroactively turns a typical human conflict into a profound tragedy of wasted time. The biological event dictates the narrative of meaning. This is why I caution against using mortality to judge the emotional rhythms of life.
It is a severe standard, yes, but it is the reality of the human condition. Biology doesn't care about our emotional rhythms, and this brings us perfectly to the characters who successfully navigated this dynamic, demonstrating that it is possible to live without that arrogant assumption of infinite time. Look at Mabel's husband, Robert, and her friend Earl. These men prove Mabel's thesis that the why behind a fulfilled life ultimately comes down to the conscious choice of being present.
Robert is certainly a beautiful example.
Exactly. Mabel notes that in 50 years of marriage, she cannot remember a single time when Robert made her feel like he had somewhere more important to be. He put the newspaper down. He gave her his full, undivided, unhurried attention. And Earl, at 86, who just wanted to be here and listen. They chose presence over a future destination.
I will certainly agree that Robert and Earl represent a wonderful ideal of human connection. The image of giving someone your undivided, unhurried attention is perhaps the most poignant takeaway from Mabel's reflections. However, let us look very closely at the timeline of Earl's life. Mabel quotes Earl as saying, "I spent 60 years trying to be somebody. Now I'm just trying to be here." He arrived at this profound wisdom at 86 years old. This suggests that the developmental stages of a human life dictate our focus just as much as conscious choices do.
Meaning what exactly? That we can't be present until we're 80?
Meaning that if you look at Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, Earl spent 60 years trying to be somebody because he was likely building a career, raising a family, contributing to his community. He was doing all the striving and forward-looking that is sociologically and biologically appropriate for the middle decades of life. You cannot achieve the final stage of integrity versus despair when you are 30 years old. To suggest that we can all simply bypass the striving phase and adopt the serene presence of an 86-year-old ignores the fundamental realities of human development. We have to build the cup before we can pour from it. To use Mabel's own metaphor, Earl's ability to just be here was afforded to him precisely because he had spent 60 years building a life that allowed him that peace in his twilight years.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. Based on the audience Mabel is speaking to, she acknowledges it is hard-earned, late-coming wisdom. But her purpose in sharing it with people who are 30, 40, or 50 is to offer a shortcut.
But is a shortcut possible or even desirable?
It absolutely is, because the striving phase you mentioned often becomes a trap. Mabel is saying that the hole inside us cannot be filled by the promotion, the corner office, or the standing ovation. She admits her own failings here. She talks about missing her daughter's dance recital for a school board meeting to impress a principal who forgot her name 2 years later. The transaction of a career will not hold your hand when the lights go out. The point of Earl's story is not that we must wait until we are 86 to be present. It's that we shouldn't waste 60 years trying to be somebody when we are already enough.
I am completely with you on the emptiness of chasing status. The realization that the feeling of being enough cannot be bought with a Teacher of the Year award in 1974 is unassailable. But I still maintain that examining why the unfulfilled fates happen to the others requires us to separate their emotional enlightenment from their biological timelines. The tragedy of these characters is not that they were uniquely flawed or uniquely arrogant, but that they were human beings caught in the intersection of their own psychological defense mechanisms and the entirely indifferent timing of the universe.
As we draw this discussion to a close, we have to synthesize these perspectives. Examining why these fates befell Mabel's characters reveals the undeniable power of human agency. Whether it is Betty deferring her bakery to a future that never came, Walter manufacturing his own suffering through resentment, or Margaret's unresolved silence over a dining room table, the ultimate tragedy is not the finality of death. It is the refusal to fully inhabit life while it is happening. Mabel's reflections demand that we stop waiting for the circumstances to settle down. We either choose to live in the present, forgive quickly, and give our undivided attention, or we let the ticking clock run out while we wait for a someday that is entirely an illusion. The responsibility for a life fully lived rests squarely on our own choices.
In summary, while I find Mabel's wisdom on radical presence and internal validation deeply moving, maintaining intellectual rigor requires us to separate the tragedy of biological mortality from the emotional choices people make. We must avoid the trap of the narrative fallacy that blames a working-class woman for dying before her pension kicked in, or a man for succumbing to cancer. We can and should strive to be as present as Robert and as peaceful as Earl, without weaponizing the unpredictable nature of death as a judgment against the messy reality of the lives people are actually living.
Despite our different analytical frameworks, I think we have found a profound point of convergence today. We both agree that Mabel's core message, that the feeling of being enough is fundamentally an internal state, rather than a geographic or professional destination, is deeply compelling. The realization that the whole isn't out there, but in here, is a truth that transcends our disagreement about the role of biological luck.
Absolutely. And we can also completely agree on the sheer value of undivided attention. The idea that providing for someone financially or sociologically is not the same as being truly present with them. Looking at the people in the room like they are the only thing that matters is perhaps the greatest gift one can give.
It truly is. Looking at these anecdotes through multiple lenses, both as a testament to radical personal agency and as a complex interaction with uncontrollable circumstance, deepens our understanding of the human condition. There is so much more to explore in Mabel Rose Thompson's 103 years of lived experience. We encourage our listeners to dive into the source material themselves and reflect on how they assign meaning to the fates of the people in their own lives. Thank you for joining us in this exploration.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep reflecting, and remember to look at the clock, not with fear, but with purpose.